Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, and thank you for joining APQC's June Human Capital Management webinar, HR Shared Services Benchmarking, Results, Trends, and Key Metrics. A few housekeeping items before we get started. This is the Q&A tool located on the right of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them here and we will answer them at the end of the webinar. This webinar will be recorded and you will receive a copy of the slides as well as the recording in a few days. Our presenters today are Karen Hilton and Scott Manning with ScottMadden. Scott Manning heads ScottMadden's corporate and shared services practice. Scott has more than 23 years of consulting experience in aerospace and defense, education, energy, entertainment, healthcare, telecommunications, manufacturing, technology, retail, and transportation in the United States and abroad, including Asia, Australia, Canada, Europe, South America, and the United Kingdom. His areas of expertise include shared service design and implementation, employee service center design and implementation, outsourcing, operations improvement, organization design and staffing, human resource management, strategic and business planning, and change implementation and management. Karen Hilton has 16 years of consulting experience with ScottMadden and has focused on shared services design and implementation, process improvement, organizational design and restructuring, and cost reduction analysis in both shared services and energy. Within shared services, she has expertise in human resources and service center design and implementation. Karen leads ScottMadden's corporate and shared services research department, which conducts industry surveys and benchmarking studies, as well as shared services customer satisfaction surveys for clients. Now I will turn the presentation over to Scott.
Good morning and good afternoon. See here, what Karen and I would like to do today is talk a little bit about ScottMadden and really set the stage for what shared services is in order to make sure that we're all on the same page as we talk about these benchmarks. We'll talk a little bit about the survey and how the survey was developed, and we'll spend the large majority of time today talking about highlights from the survey. We'll close with a summary as well as talking about, if you're interested, how to be involved in next year's cycle, which will take place in the fall of 2013. A little bit about ScottMadden. ScottMadden is a medium-sized general management consulting firm. We were actually founded in 1983, and thus we're celebrating our 30th year this year. We're a recognized leader in the shared services space, including significant depth in HR, finance, IT, and supply chain. But we work across all types of shared services setups, including engineering services, environmental health and safety, legal, real estate and facilities, fleet, and several other areas. I guess like many consulting firms, we think we're different, but let me tell you a little bit about that. We provide, most of our consultants are experienced when they come to us, so even our entry-level consultants have 5 to 7 years of work experience before they join ScottMadden. Our partners, which Karen and I are, consult, unlike many firms. We spend a targeted 50% of our time actually providing advice and counsel to our clients. While we really focus on leveraging leading practices and benchmarks for our clients, we work diligently to tailor our solutions to the needs and the specific nuances of our clients. A significant amount of our work is actually implementation focused, and we do a lot of work behind large strategy firms like a McKinsey to actually implement some of their recommendations. And finally, one of the things I think really sets us apart is that we actively involve our clients in the design and implementation of their shared services operations, so that when we walk out the door, our clients are prepared to pick those operations up and be successful with them. At ScottMadden, we work across the corporate and shared services lifecycle, from strategy development to design to build and improve. Our projects are wide-ranging. We actually have done design and build work for very, very small service centers to the tune of 10 to 15 seats, as well as very large service centers to the tune of over 300 seats. We've worked to transform complete HR service delivery models, and we've done so in 40 countries around the globe. We've also done quite a bit of work combining shared services setups, HR shared services setups for mergers and acquisitions, so combining the operations of two disparate companies. While we are a mid-sized firm, we boast, I think, a very nice client list. We work across industries and across with a wide range of companies. We have clients like a NASA, a Pfizer Pharmaceutical, a Northrop Grumman, a Towers Watson, a Staples, Thermo Fisher, or Warner Brothers, as well as many of the clients that you see represented here on this page. All right, enough about us. Let's talk a little bit about shared services. One of the things that Karen and I see when we are at clients or at conferences is that people talk about shared services, and when they do, they talk about it very, very differently. In HR, when we're really what we're talking about is we're talking about a service delivery model, typically that has three components. It has a transactional administrative component, it has a center of expertise component, and typically it'll have a field staff component made up of business partners or business partners and generalists. Those two former functions, the COE and the transactional piece, typically handled by a service center, are really what are shared and are referred to as shared services. Now, in a shared services concept, what we're trying to do is we're trying to really leverage the strengths of both a centralized and decentralized model. So in the centralized model, really leveraging the economies of scale and leveraging standardization or standardized approaches and processes, while from the decentralized side, really looking to leverage that focus on the business, knowing what the business does, knowing what the business is capable of, as well as leveraging that customer intimacy, that customer focus. Now, that's achieved by developing the model or the overall model, but really where it comes from is through these middle pieces here, is really having a service culture, having a very well-defined, integrated service delivery model, leveraging best practices, focusing on customer satisfaction and metrics, and having some standard infrastructure like service level agreements, defined products and services, defined governance structures, etc. Now, you can have a centralized model that's not shared, and really what you're seeing, the difference there between centralized and shared is, one is it's missing these middle pieces that I just spoke of, like the leading practices or the metrics, but also it's about where the direction comes from. In a shared services model, really what HR is doing is it's really tightly integrated with its customer, and it's responding to customer needs. It's responding to input from its customers as it makes decisions. In a centralized model, really where that direction is coming from, it's coming from the functional leadership or corporate. So it's the HR function through its leaders deciding what it's going to provide to customers versus really seeking input. And that's the key difference that we see between centralized and shared. Just one further explanation for what this model looks like in practice. As you can see here on this page, page 9, where we have the shared pieces, the service center, typically also including self-service as well as the centers of expertise. The service center is really handling transaction and administrative work. So questions, it's handling, again, transactions. So if I need to update an address, an emergency contact, if I need to make a benefits change. The centers of expertise are really doing program design, policy interpretation, some program delivery. And then the decentralized piece, our business partners are in the field. They're working with leaders and managers to help those leaders and managers achieve their goals and strategies. If you think about how this works, if we take an example, let's say that in the field a manager or a leader is having some issues with a sales organization, they don't seem to be motivated they don't seem to be properly motivated. He or she may work with a business partner to diagnose that as a compensation problem or incentive compensation problem. That business partner would work with the center of expertise to update or refine the incentive compensation plan. The business partners, probably again with the center of expertise, would work to implement that in that operating company or division. And then when the employees would have questions and/or need updates in terms of what their comp has been or how it's being paid, they would interact with the service center. What we see is we see savings of using this model of running around 25% of operating costs. We see payback of implementing shared services models right around 2 to 3 years. And you see a lot of interesting changes and dynamics, such as one particular client Karen and I had. We saw a 30-point increase in customer sat among organized labor because the service center actually gave them a direct outlet for questions. Let's talk a little bit about the APQC ScottMadden survey. What we found in our consulting practice is that while there were lots of benchmarks and metrics that existed for HR, they were benchmarks and metrics that were across or without specificity to service delivery model. We worked with APQC to try to rectify that by having a benchmarking survey that was focused specifically on those organizations that had implemented a robust shared services model. We engaged APQC because of their background and their reputation for creating a very thorough, very thought-out process which creates apples to apples benchmarks. And then we brought to bear our shared services knowledge in terms of designing the survey. We conducted the first cycle in the fall of 2011. We conducted our second cycle in the fall of 2012, and we'll be conducting the next cycle in the fall of this year. The survey has just under 35 metrics as well as just under 25 qualitative questions. It's a pretty robust survey to complete, but it also provides a great bit of data. The survey right now is focused on North America companies. We do have some survey participants that have global operations, but we pulled data from just the North American operation. One of the things that we'd like to do is from our audience get a feel for your shared services operation. So we have a polling question here. If you could respond here, we'll actually be able to display the results. But if you do or don't have a survey, or you're in the planning stages, there are some radio buttons to hit there. If you have been in operations for less than 2 years, operations between 2 and 5 years, or greater, if you've been up and running for more than 5 years, we'd like to hear from you. And there are results. So pretty good spread. Well, it's actually seeing a little bit that's going to be a little different than our survey participants, but we've got about just under 30% who don't have a model, 11% that are in the planning stages, and then about just over 50% that have been up and running for more than 2 years. So that's a great mix for our audience. Let's talk now about this and spend the rest of our time talking a little bit about the survey. We've organized our results into 4 categories. 1, delivery model and operations. That's really about how companies set up and deploy their service delivery models, including sort of what's in scope and what they deliver from specific channels. 2 is really the staffing component. This is what you would expect, really a head count, span of control, and some nuances around specific delivery, specific functions. 3 is performance. We're looking at actually how the shared services model performs, things like average speed to answer, first contact resolution. Those would be elements that talk about the performance specifically to the service center. And then the shared service organization management and technology, so looking at things like reporting structure, service level agreements, governance structures, etc. A little bit about the demographics. Of the survey participants. It was pretty balanced this year, as it was in 2011. We saw really roughly about a quarter each of folks who had less than a year, 1 to 3 years, or 3 to 5 years of shared services operations. About 30, well, just at 32% of our survey respondents were at more than 5 years. So a really, really nice cross-section of experience. And then we had a pretty good representation of industries as well. Some cluster, about 70% of our respondents were in these top 4: manufacturing, professional, scientific, and technical, finance and insurance, and healthcare. One of the things that we do is we actually, when we're collecting data, collect across, I think, about 20 different industries, and then we collapse them to give us a bit more summary level view of participants here. One of the things that we are seeing, that Karen and I see just in that 4th bucket there, healthcare and social assistance, we're seeing much more interest among healthcare companies and higher education, so it's sort of a not-for-profit sector, or sort of a with shared services. So it's becoming a model and becoming an accepted model as it moves into some of these other industry groups. From a revenue perspective, a pretty good equal split between the $1 billion, $1 to $5 billion, and $5 to $10 billion sized companies. So you see roughly about 60% of the respondents were greater than $5 billion, and about 40% were less than $5 billion. In terms of types of models used in the actual setup, if you think about the most mature model would be this one down here in the bottom left, the single global center. So one service center serving the entire organization across the globe. And we saw 18% of our respondents had that. That was actually a very similar response rate to what we saw in 2011 in the 2011 survey. The next most mature model would really be up here in the upper right, which would be a regional center with global management and integration. About 36% of our respondents had that model. That's up from 18% in 2011. Most likely where that's coming from is more integration, more consolidation of either the country-specific centers, which had 12% this year, and actually 27% of those, 27% of our respondents in 2011 results, as well as maybe some of the locally run site and country-specific models. What you see a lot from a global perspective is that the more, let me say, the challenging countries like France or Germany that have strong laws for data privacy, strong work council organizations, really may have more site-specific type setups for HR, whereby you can get away with larger regional centers in countries that aren't so inclined. And you can see also one of the things that we're seeing much more is a global business services setup, where we see integration across the globe, whereby if you do have multiple service centers, they may be focused on working around the clock to get transactions processed to be more customer oriented, or they may be more tightly integrated with some of the other aspects of the company like finance or accounts payable. And you can see here that really is representative of the folks with regional centers or site-specific country centers, as well as single global centers. One of the things that we also studied was how the shared services how the service centers were organized. I would say in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when organizations or service centers specifically were set up, they were set up with frontline customer service representatives and supervisors. And those supervisors were more experienced, had a broader set of a broader background, and they really worked as a tier 2, an escalation point. So if a customer service rep didn't know an answer or needed assistance, they turned to that supervisor. What we're now seeing, and have been seeing for the last 5 or so years, is that tier 2 model, which about 2/3 of our respondents have, is really morphed into specialty services. Really what we're seeing is specialty services around recruiting and staffing, HR administration, which would include things like detailed reporting and leaves of absence, to name a few. Really, again, we believe this is a result of increased use of self-service, so employees and managers being able to transact for themselves, as well as the proliferation of HR portals, which would allow some of that transaction. The other thing that we're seeing here from the standpoint is we're seeing that as this model matures, and again with the use of technologies, we're seeing that the scope within HR continues to expand. So, for example, while companies like a McDonald's, who are more retail-oriented, have done this for years, we're seeing that companies that have fewer geographic, are less widely spread from a geographic perspective, begin to pick up things like employee relations, if nothing more than capturing intake and able to report on statistics that they are seeing from a grievance perspective, for example. But we're seeing services expand to other aspects or more difficult aspects of human resources, like employee relations. We also looked at the delivery of services, where those services were delivered. So were they insourced or outsourced? And we continue to see some pretty common trends here. So in 2011, we saw, from an insource perspective, employee policy questions, so really general Q&A. Most of our respondents, over 90% of our respondents, had that insourced, as well as severance and separations and workforce administration. Running in the 80 to 90% range. And then this year we also saw new hire processing and employee files and records management as highly insourced services. From an outsourced perspective, we continue to see sort of the pension, 401k, outsourced, at least if we look at frequency, outsourced in the 30 to 40% range. Benefits administration and unemployment, those were all outsourced at the top outsourced components in 2011, and they continue to be so for 2012. We also saw this year relocation and employee verification as highly outsourced or as significantly outsourced. In HR, we continue to see less and less tolerance of large-scale business process outsourcing and much more use of, I'm going to call it, discrete service outsourcing. So taking a discrete service like pension or 401k or benefits administration and finding a vendor to do that for me versus sending all of my HR administration out. So we continue to see the internal use of shared services as well, including service centers and COEs as a very, very viable model. If we go a little deeper in terms of that staffing setup and we look at how that works by COE or by center of expertise, we see a couple things. One is, as you might expect, talent acquisition tends to be the most highly staffed service offering or center of expertise. Running for our median respondents somewhere in the 1 to 800 to 1 to 1,200 for our top performers. So one talent acquisition staff per 800 employees at the company. We also see generally talent management with a fairly high ratio, although it varies. For our median performers, it's running in the 1 to 1,500 range. For our top performers, in the 1 to 4,000 range. Karen and I think this is largely because the models for talent management vary significantly. We can have a model that says a lot of our talent management delivery, while we may have a COE that provides the programs, the delivery is done by our generalists. We can also have models that say we're going to have the COE do a lot of that delivery and it will be done by specialists that work across the company and travel, or we can have a model that says we're going to have more talent management generalists that are part of the COE and are more specifically staffed to a site or location. So there are still a lot of different models. No real winner from a model perspective around talent management, so that has an impact on that wide range of staffing. You can see that comp, benefits, and employer labor relations tend to be a little more running in the sort of the 1 to 2,500 to 1 to 4,000 range. Benefits, again, is going to be one of these functions or one of these COEs that we have a high degree of variance in based on whether or not the company or the respondent is leveraging outsourcing as a component to deliver some of those services. One of the questions that we get quite frequently is how to set up centers of expertise. And we'll talk about this from a couple different aspects. One is co-location. Are we putting our COEs together? Are we putting compensation, benefits, talent management, employee labor relations, and talent acquisition in a single location, or building them so that they're located centrally? Or are they located out in the business? And the predominant model is certainly co-location. Now, if you look across COEs, it is much easier to co-locate a benefit COE or a compensation COE because, for example, with talent acquisition, most people are going to want to put recruiters out in the business. And so while there may be centralized or easily co-located aspects of that COE, such as the sourcing function, we're typically going to see some of that allocated on a regional or even maybe more local basis so that they can do recruiting and work more directly with managers and leaders. Similarly, with employee relations and labor relations, we'll see a small centralized employee or labor relations function, but in most of our clients, employee relations is going to be acted on through the generalist population, so we would see some centrally located functions, but some not, and labor relations specialists would operate under a similar model. And we've talked just on the previous slide about talent management. And then from a virtualization perspective, we hear a lot of chatter about virtualization, but our survey results show that it's a lot more talk than actual actual putting together folks who are sitting in anywhere they may want to sit. We see that again, I think, based on the type of model applied with a particular COE. So much easier to have local staff, or much more required to have local staff with talent acquisition or talent management or labor relations, much less required to have local staff with benefits and compensation. But you can see from this graphic that we get a mixture, that the predominant model is either a significant co-location or all co-location of staff, with nearly just 20 to 30% of virtualization. And again, that virtualization is much more likely in a model that requires it. And then one of the things that we've also investigated with this survey is what is, while not part of the not truly defined as shared services, certainly part of the service delivery model, is about that field staff. So HR business partners, generalists, those folks who are out in the operating companies, out in the divisions, out in the units, supporting leaders and managers. First thing that we looked at is really what's the level of staffing. Historically, if you look at a Saratoga, you would look across the HR model and say, well, gosh, somewhere in that 1 to 85, 1 to 115, depending on the type of industry, would be what I would expect. So one HR person per 85 company employees, for example. What we're seeing, if we focus just in on the generalists, is that we see our median companies running just under a 1 to 300 ratio, our top performers running at a 1 to 600 ratio, which actually aligns pretty well with how we build our shared services setups. We typically would, based on variables like the size of the company, the geographic spread of operations, how technology is used, build those operations in a 1 to 250, 1 to 500 range. 600 is pretty aggressive, but again, if you're leveraging technology and your operations are more centralized and decentralized, you could certainly get to that range. Now, I will say that one of the key aspects of success of a shared services model is just this component, is the business partner generalist component. One of the things that we see our clients struggle with is getting the right types of skills in these positions to make sure that the model is successful. There's a tendency to take the individuals prior to setting up a shared services model, take the individuals that currently play these roles and let them play the role in the future. But oftentimes these folks have been successful because they've been focused on the transactions, the administrative aspects, and they have a very, very difficult time transitioning to one of providing strategic guidance to their leaders and managers. as well as they're not well positioned with those leaders and managers to do that function. And finally, from a delivery model and operations perspective, what do we see from a how the field folks are organized? We're seeing really that the large majority of our respondents have multiple levels of field HR employees, which is really very good. It's a very good strategy from a career pathing perspective. So we may have generalists who are more focused on managers or more experienced employees. We may have business partners who are more focused on the actual business leaders. And what we also saw, to our surprise, was some, over half had some HR administrators in the field. We actually have seen, we were surprised by this because of their own work. We tend to try to pull that work, that HR administrator work, at least from a domestic perspective, into the service center. Now, we will say that the more global you are, the more that job is required because of high variance in services across different countries and requirements across different countries. But we'd really like to see that that bar continue to shrink so that there's less confusion to the end user on where to go for services. And Karen, I'm going to let you pick up and start talking a little bit about our staffing highlights.
Okay, great. Thanks, Scott. The staffing is the second major topic covered in the study. And as you can imagine, having staffing benchmarks for different service center and center of expertise groups provides an important guide when you're building a shared services organization or when you're trying to improve one. This is an area where we really felt there was not much readily available data for some of these specific staff ratios and was a core component when we were designing the survey. When we look at the ratio of customers to total service center headcount, the median is 751 this year. This is quite a bit lower than a commonly used rule of thumb of 1 to 1,000, with one service center employee for every 1,000 customers. The lower ratio here obviously translates to higher service center headcount. We typically have used the 1 to 1,000 ratio to define the top end of a staff range, and Erlang models based on projected call volumes to define the bottom end of the range when formulating the staff for a new service center. This metric in particular is one that tends to fluctuate based on increases in the use of technology and the changing role of specialists, which makes it very important to measure and monitor. While the median reflects higher staffing this year, when we look at the data, we think this is due to a different mix of participants in this year's cycle versus a true trend. Okay, next, we also looked at staffing. For those that are using a tiered delivery model, we measured staffing ratios by tier. Our data indicate higher staffing levels for Tier 2 specialists compared to Tier 1 generalists. We believe this reflects the shift to higher value services and increased use of self-service that Scott mentioned. Essentially, some of the Tier 1 work has been pushed to Tier 0, and the scope of higher valued specialist work has increased. If you think about these ratios with an example company of about 50,000 employees, with the median ratio, you'd expect approximately 30 Tier 1 staff and 44 Tier 2 staff. In the staffing area, we also examined span of control for service center staff. As we would expect, a broader span of control exists for the Tier 1 staff than the Tier 2 staff. Since the Tier 2 consists of more common general positions, whereas Tier 2 often includes a variety of specialist groups, those are requiring more narrow spans in order to effectively manage. This relationship is consistent with what we saw in the first cycle of the study in 2011. Next, we looked at staffing levels for specialist groups within the service center. While these are often part of Tier 2 if you're using a tiered model, they can also be set up as dedicated groups in a non-tiered model. When looking across the specialist groups, we see higher staffing levels focused on employee relations and workforce administration. And workforce administration is defined as those activities where you would have most of your HRIS transactions. The specialist areas that tend to have lower staff levels are the leave of absence administration and training administration. In all the cases, these ratios will depend on your overall service center scope and the degree to which these different functions are being handled by the service center. Next, we'll shift to metrics focused on the performance of the service center. These relate to the customer experience, productivity, as well as cost. On this page, we've shown a comparison of average speed to answer and first contact resolution by delivery model, whether you're using a tiered model or a non-tiered model. What our data show is that the tiered models have a better average speed to answer, while the non-tiered models are able to achieve a higher first contact resolution. For the non-tiered models, they're more likely to be routing calls to specialists directly and therefore require less escalation, which allows them to resolve more calls on the first contact. We also examined several productivity metrics in the study. On this page, we show benchmarks for monthly transactions completed per Tier 1 headcount, as well as monthly calls or inquiries handled per Tier 1 headcount. And as you can see, there's a big performance gap. We find that the top performing service centers are able to handle almost 5 times as many transactions and almost 6 times as many calls as bottom performers, showing the wide range of performance on this metric. As you can imagine, this difference can have a significant impact on staffing levels and ultimately your cost of operations. Likewise, we looked at performance in terms of cost, using the metric of total service center cost per customer served. Again, we see wide variance in performance, with the top performing service centers' cost per employee served less than a quarter that of the bottom performing centers. Factors such as your staffing levels, technology costs, facility costs, and vendor costs all come into play with this metric. This is another area that in the past we had found hard to benchmark and therefore was one that we wanted to include in the study. With more companies including talent acquisition activities within the service center scope, we also looked at efficiency metrics for these transactions. These efficiency measures also show variation for the number of requisitions that are processed and the number of hires that are handled per the specialist headcount dedicated to those services. The degree of the automation of the processes or use of technology is a key driver in terms of the differences we see between top performers and bottom performers here. When you look at the requisitions, there's an increase by a factor of 9 between the median value and the top performer value. In terms of the total number of hires handled, there's an increase of about 2.5 between the median and the top performer. Our final category of metrics and questions in the study dealt with management infrastructure and shared services and the use of technology. Scott described some of the things that are included in the management infrastructure, and we'll start there. The first topic is around the governance or reporting structure of the shared services organization. Our study finds that predominantly HR shared services organizations report to the lead HR executive. This is true despite the fact that the majority report they have shared services in place across multiple functions. We find that there are often significant silos that exist between HR and finance, and therefore these organizations tend to develop shared services on their own. This seems to be true mainly in the United States, where organizations will start with a single function shared services and then over time gravitate to a multifunction model. However, our experience in Latin America and Europe shows that there are many more multifunction setups that start from the beginning in those regions. As more companies move to a true multifunction or global business services model, we expect these results will shift. Next, we asked about the degree to which service level agreements are being used. We found that less formal approaches are becoming more common. As you can see, about 65% reported using either an informal approach for service level agreements or are not using service level agreements at all. Only a quarter of the respondents indicated that they're using service level agreements with all of their customers. Another aspect of the management infrastructure is the use of chargebacks for services. And these can take lots of different formulations. They can be official chargebacks where the actually costs are provided and allocations are made within the company, or they can be showbacks where you're just showing the cost of the services for the knowledge of your customers and be able to drive behavior. Similar to the results that we saw with service level agreements, the use of formal chargebacks is less extensive than what we've seen in the past. Over half reported not using chargebacks for HR services. For those who do use chargebacks, the majority are charging back for services based on employee headcount in the customer organizations. A final topic in this section is the use of portals. Portal use is something that we found can have an important impact on how you staff your center. It's important to understand up front your intended use of a portal and what impact it may have on your organization. We asked about the volume of portal hits per employee and the nature of the portal being used, ranging from not leveraging a portal at all the way up through personalized content with full system integration, which we would consider to be a truly optimized portal arrangement. The portal hits varied significantly, as you can see. When we look at the top performers, though, the majority of the top performers for this metric are the ones that are using portals with personalized content and full system integration. This shows the potential impact of being able to fully leverage this type of technology as part of your service delivery approach and making this a key element in your self-service environment. Looking across the survey, we have a few summary findings. First, a tiered delivery model continues to be most common for HR service centers. Second, shared services organization staffing is higher for Tier 2 specialists versus Tier 1 generalists due to the shift we talked about in the higher value services and increased use of self-service, which is shifting the work from Tier 1 to Tier 0. Next, as we discussed, the governance of the HR shared services organization is most commonly through an HR executive, despite evidence of multifunction shared services models. Third, we do see some lower adoption for some traditional shared services management infrastructure, specifically the service level agreements and chargebacks. And finally, as you can see by some of the gaps that we talked about, the top performing shared services organizations continue to achieve significant efficiency gains in cost and performance. Essentially, this shows that there's a big difference if you can optimize your operations. One thing we also did this year was we looked across a subset of the performance metrics and examined some of the characteristics of the top performers for those metrics. While we don't feel this is conclusive, we found that the top performers most often had these characteristics. First, they were using a tiered model. They tended to be more mature. Most of the top performers had 3 or more years of maturity. And they're governed by a lead HR executive. These were often also part of a global shared services organization. It's not surprising to see that the mature organizations among the top performers, as companies typically have dedicated continuous improvement functions to focus on processes and achieve better performance over time. So we hope you'll decide to participate in the next cycle of the study. As Scott mentioned, we'll be running the study this fall. And if you're interested in participating, please contact us at info@scottmadden.com. When we hear from you, we will send back an overview of the study as well as a list of all the metrics that were included in the last cycle. And then you can expect a follow-up from us in late summer or early fall. And we want to make sure that everybody knows there's no cost to participate in the study. As a result of your participation, you'll receive a very detailed report of all the metrics and qualitative questions. And then we also, APQC does a great job of being able to provide peer group comparisons So these can be based on size of your company in terms of the revenue, the industry that you're in, and potentially other things based on our mix of participants. So we thank you very much for listening to the webinar, and now we're going to let Krista facilitate some Q&A.
All right, wonderful. Again, if you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A tool, and we'll get to them. We did have questions come through, and the first one is, does in-source services mean the organization is providing the services internally to the organization?
Yes, the in-source would be that the company is providing it itself internally to the organization or the company. That's correct.
Okay, great. And then the survey ranked shared services operations according to portal hits per 1,000 employees. Over what period of time were the number of portal hits measured?
They were reported on an annual, for a year period, and then the monthly metric was calculated.
What should HR Shared Services Centers keep in mind from a people management perspective? What are the best practices for managing HR Shared Services staff?
Wow, that's a really good, very broad question. We actually, Karen actually conducts an annual, what I'm going to call talent management survey, which we just produced results for. So I'm going to leverage that to respond. What we found from the participants of that response was the most effective method for engaging employees in an HR shared service setup was regular communications. The next most effective method was award and recognition programs. If I dive a little deeper into the data or our results for that, what we saw was if we look specifically at retention, then the most effective method for retaining employees was noted as upward career potential, so that career path that we talked about earlier, followed, and about 52% of our respondents cited that as the most important. About 21% of our respondents cited monetary incentives as the most important, and as we got into those more deeply, the most effective monetary reward or incentive was actually incentive compensation plans, followed by cash rewards, followed by non-monetary awards. So maybe that provides a little bit of a data-oriented answer to that question.
Great. Can you please elaborate or further define what constitutes a tiered delivery model? We've had a few questions on that.
Typically what we see, is we talk about tiers in terms of different avenues for providing the service. And so we often talk in terms of tier 0. That would be the service provided without a human intervention. So I can go online and get an answer, or I can go online and transact. So I can, for example, change my benefits elections. Tier 1 would be my transaction or question is handled by a generalist, somebody without a specific focus in an employee service center. So it's a customer service representative who is using technology, oftentimes a knowledge base, which is a repository of answers to respond to the individual and or make or complete the transaction. Tier 2 is typically somebody with a specialist expertise that's having to answer the question or transact. And what we're seeing these days as more people are able to transact themselves, we're seeing that Tier 2 being handled really focused on a couple different areas. One is recruiting and staffing. So we've got a group who are doing things like scheduling interviews, processing candidate expenses, doing new hire data entry, elements like that, and or leave and or HR administration. Karen, anything to add there?
No, I think that was a good summary.
All right. Back on slide 32, I think you spoke about the SLAs. Someone asked, what's the reason for the drop in percentage and not having SLAs? Do you have any insight on that?
Scott, one thing, and I'll let you comment too, but I know often many of our clients will start off using formal SLAs at the beginning of their operations because they're wanting to make those service expectations clear with their customers and get off to a good start in terms of managing that customer relationship. And then as they become more mature, they find that they've got an effective working relationship and the need for formal SLAs tends to drop off, so they move to a more informal. So there could be some of that driven by the fact that we had a pretty good representation of some of the more mature organizations participating in the study. But anything else you would add to that, Scott?
No, not at all. I think that's exactly right.
All right. What type of activities do organizations transfer to a shared services operation in the staffing function?
I think so again, if you think about shared services, we're going to have two elements of that shared services. We're going to have the centers of expertise, which would be shared and work across the organization, and we would have the service center specifically. In the service center, again, what we're seeing is that recruiting and staffing is really set up as more of a specialty group, Tier 2, and they are doing things, like I just said, handling scheduling interviews, maybe doing resume screening, doing new hire data entry, processing candidate expenses, answering candidate questions, compiling feedback and/or evaluation results on candidates, maybe even processing offer letters. In the COE, in the Center of Expertise, you're going to actually find more of they would own and manage the actual recruiting process. They would handle any escalated questions that couldn't be handled by the Tier 2 group. They would actually, depending on your model, do manager intake sessions, so planning the actual how the recruiting process is going to go for a particular position. They may be participating in the recruiting, doing initial screens of the candidates, maybe recruiting, down selecting candidates to provide managers with one or two candidates that are most qualified, and then working with the managers to select.
All right, and if you had to pick, where would you focus improvement efforts if you had to pick 1 to 2 metrics?
Wow, that's a tough question. What Karen and I would recommend, I believe, would be that the first thing to do would be to baseline your operations. So to really look across your either your HR service delivery model or your shared services operations and figure out how you're performing. And then what I would also suggest, or what we would also suggest, is then matching that against what your customer needs are to figure out what the top 2 or 3 priorities would be, and then to focus on some combination of improving those priorities as well as maybe improving those metrics that you're performing least well at. But it's got to be very, very focused on your customer set and your current operation.
All right, great. And now I think we're going to go ahead and move over to Alyssa Tucker, who is our Research Program Manager in the HR space at APQC, to just give some closing thoughts, and then we'll go ahead and end the webinar here in a couple minutes. And again, thank you so much to Scott and Karen. It was a wonderful presentation. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Krista. This is Alyssa Tucker, and I also want to just extend a big thank you to Karen Hilton and Scott Manning from ScottMadden for presenting this really unique and very highly valuable information to our audience today. And what we'd like to do is leave our listeners with some additional resources that can be of assistance as they go to apply what we learned today. I want to let you know that recent APQC research has revealed that effective use of an HR Shared Services Center is a characteristic that high-performing and strategic HR functions have in common. And you can assess your HR function's service delivery and performance with this checklist, which is based on a survey that APQC conducted with AIMC, which stands for the Association of Internal Management Consultants. And then a majority of the participants in this APQC AIMC survey said that their HR organization delivers administrative and strategic HR services moderately well. The survey results show that HR shared services has an important role to play in helping HR move from a moderate to a higher level of performance, and we have some resources on this slide that talk about that study. And when combined when the survey findings are combined with soon-to-be released APQC case study research, we find that strategic HR functions use HR shared services, HR outsourcing, and HR technology to establish the credibility and to free up the time that are required to focus on strategic initiatives that contribute significantly to the organization's bottom line. So you can read about this study that APQC just conducted on strategic HR partnerships, which talks about the important role that HR shared services plays in these partnerships in the blog post that is linked on this slide. And you can also watch APQC's knowledge base as well as our All Things HCM webpage for these survey study results, which will be released very soon. And then finally, I want to let you know that we have many more resources from ScottMadden and APQC. If you're not aware, ScottMadden has spoken on 2 other webinars this year for APQC and provided other resources through that on how to implement and improve shared services centers. So please check out those resource collections. There are links on this slide, and all listeners will receive a copy of these slide decks so that you can click these hyperlinks and access those resources. So I will turn things over to Krista, who will conclude our calls for today.
All right, again, thank you so much to Karen and Scott. We really appreciate it, and I just want to thank everyone again for your time, and we're going to go ahead and end the call. Like Alyssa said, you will get a copy of the slides and recording via email and access to these links as well. And thanks again, everyone. Hope you have a great day. Bye.